Today I'm going to try and answer the question, can Jakob break the 1500 meter world record? He ran 328.33. Was it 33? I think it was something like that anyway. 328.3 at the Olympics. And the world record by Hisham Al Garouj set in 1997 was 326.00. So there's a fair ways to go, 2.3 seconds or so. But I think there's definite reasons to assume that Jakob could have run faster than in Tokyo. I guess first of all, if you would extrapolate a few of the, there's probably three main reasons I would say. The first one is that he ran wide on the first lap. Sure, it wasn't a huge amount of extra distance, but especially on the first bend, he was out in lane 2 and 3. There's a reason why the 200-meter race has a stagger, right? Lane 2 gets a head start over lane 1 because they have to run further around the bend. And so I think it's safe to assume, in the ideal or perfect situation, Jakob, let's say we'll give him 0.5 of a second just to be, give us a round number for that. So there's half of a second right there. The second one is that he ran 3 rounds. Running 3 rounds at a major championship takes its toll. It's not the ideal way to prepare for one singular race. They never do it if you're setting up for a world record normally in an ideal situation. But it's what you have to do to qualify for the finals. And even though a guy like Jakob has got a huge amount of endurance and amount of strength from all of the miles he puts in, rumors are 110, 120 miles a week with all of those monstrous threshold sessions, but it's still going to take a little bit of a toll, especially in Tokyo when the rounds were all pretty fast, faster than historically speaking. And then also there's the conditions to consider. It was humid, it was hot. It was a stressful environment, not the ideal situation, and yet he crushed it still, in spite of that. But I would say that running extra rounds is a good second. I would say as a second to take off from an ideal situation if you were tapering in an ideal world. So what I say, half a second for running extra distance, a second for running 3 rounds. That's 1.5 seconds. So we need another 0.8 of a second to get that 2.3. Did he have 0.8? The third reason, I guess, is did he have 0.8 of a second in him because he was holding back or he wasn't fully extended? Was he really, did he give a maximal effort in order to win? And the short answer there is no, he didn't give a maximal effort. He definitely was able to do what he needed to and what he wanted to in the race, and he wasn't overextended in the last 120 meters. He passed on a bend. Normally you don't pass on a bend if you're feeling tired, you wait to the straightaway. But he passed Chariot with 120 to go, went by him, looked back a couple of times. Sure, he dipped, he leant forward out of sort of like habit or racing instinct, I suppose, but the question is how much was he holding back relative to like an all-out effort? That could be anywhere from maybe a half a second to 1.5 seconds, who knows? So let's assume it's worth 0.8 of a second, so that gets him right at the 2.3 needed to run 326.00. Okay, so can he run the world record? Well, we've talked about ideal, perfect situations when all the stars align, but that rarely or never happens. So the question is, how can he, on his team and the meet directors and all the people interested in the different players in the sport, help create that perfect environment where it's possible? And I think there are several factors in play. There's sort of the main ones to me are getting the perfect weather, the perfect environment where there's no wind, it's the perfect temperature for your body to respond well. Second one is you have to have perfect pacemaking. And then third one is you've got to time it with your fitness being right when you're in your peak shape. So if we're looking at weather and this season, there's a few meets remaining in the season. So if you're trying to get the right meet and the right weather system, the next meet coming up this weekend is the Prefontaine Classic. It's a mile, not a 1500 meters, which I actually think probably lends itself more to Jakob's strengths. He's more of an endurance-based runner. Al Garouj probably had a 143, low 144 in him if he had specialized in the 800. Jakob's more like a 145 guy. Like he's more strength-based. He can go up to the half marathon. It wouldn't even surprise me if he could keep up with, if not beat, the top 10K runners in the world. So the extra distance, the extra 109 meters, just allows the race to be a little bit slower in order to use strength. So the mile could be in threat this weekend at Prefontaine, but unfortunately, I think the weather's going to sort of put a stop to that. Sure, I might be completely embarrassed and they go out and crush it and run a 3:42 and beat the 3:43 world record, but traditionally the wind in Haywood comes from the northwest, which hits the runners in the back straight and around that final bend for the first sort of 40-50 meters of that bend. And that's really tough on the third lap and on the fourth lap when you're really trying to hold your rhythm before the final kick. And that's what the weather forecast is for again in Haywood this weekend. Unfortunately, the TV networks sort of dictate the times of races in the US. All of the pro meets are always in the afternoon to suit the TV schedules, and I think it's 2:40 in the afternoon, maybe it's 3:40, but regardless, the afternoon weather is looking for like a 9-mile-per-hour wind hitting exactly that spot on the back straight. So unless Tim Chariot decides to be a designated pacemaker again as a paid person, or is just going out for the race to try and break the world record himself, and he could potentially block the win for Jakob, I think Pre's out of the question. So the next meets that sort of potentially up for grabs would be Brussels. Brussels is going to be a bit cold this year. I looked at the forecast. In my opinion, probably the best 1500 meter race performance-wise ever from two guys. It wasn't the world record, but in 2001 in Brussels, Bernard Lagat pushed Algarouge right to the line. They ran 3:26 low. So for two of them to run 3:26, it obviously was pretty mint conditions. And you can look up the historical data of the weather, and it was like low 80 degrees, 82 I believe, and zero wind. But Brussels this year, unfortunately, it's going to be a lot cooler and maybe a bit of rain and a bit of wind as well. So I think that sort of takes Brussels out of the equation. Sure, you can say weather's not that much of a factor, but we're talking about milliseconds in order for him to break the world record, right? So I think Brussels out of the equation. Zurich is still on the schedule, and that actually looks perfect, like low 80s, no wind. I've always wondered about Zurich, like, sure, people run really fast there, but I personally have struggled at some races in Switzerland when there are a little bit of elevation. It's really minuscule, but at like 1,300 feet is Zurich, and maybe that's enough to like lower the air resistance, right? The air pressure is a little lower when you're at altitude, but I think the guys like Jakob Ingebrigtsen, they train at altitude, so maybe that's not as much of a factor. But I think the number one factor at Zurich is that it's later in the year. It's going to be September 12th. Can he hold that peak form that he obviously had in Tokyo for another month or 5 weeks afterwards? That's a long time to hold that fitness. Or is it a chance for him to like build on that fitness and get it more? I'm not totally sure. I think definitely some of the other guys are going to struggle by that late in the season. And so I guess I'll skip to my next point before I talk about some other venues, but that's going to be the other main factor is pacemaking. If he's going to need help from people, especially guys like Chariot, or find some other pacemakers to get him to 1,200 meters, September's going to be really tough to have guys still in shape. To run 3:26, I think he's going to probably need to run 2:45 point through the 1,200 and come home on a 40. That's a tall order to run a 2:45. There's probably only 3 or 4 guys in the world right now who are capable of that. If they only get him to 1,100 meters, maybe he can run the whole last 400 on his own. But traditionally, it's been tough. When Algarouge broke the world record, he had Nien, the Olympic champion, to go beat him the next couple of years later at the Olympic Games, be his pacemaker. And he got him to 1,200. And then when he only ran 3:26 low only, his rabbits only got him to 1,100 meters. So I think that's going to be probably the biggest challenge for Camp Ingebrigtsen, is to try and find someone willing and able to get him to that point. It's going to cost a lot of money as someone who's willing to sort of sacrifice their reputation because they're not in the race themselves. I'm sure guys like Josh Kerr and Chariot would love to be in the race themselves, so they may not be the ideal situation. But I think Abel Kipsang, the guy who's 4th in the Olympics, and the other person, I was trying to think outside the box, who would be a good 800 meter runner who's also got 1,500 meter strength to get him through. And the person that came to mind was Elliot Giles of Great Britain. He might be someone willing. It's an off distance, so there's not the same like ego issue of going as a pacemaker. I know a lot of athletes aren't willing to be rabbits in their prime of their careers, but that spot's probably needed. So whether they get Elliot Giles or Abel Kipsang, or maybe Chariot is willing to go after the world record himself, that would be the ideal situation, right? Because then Ingebrigtsen could just tuck in on him. They both race for the world record, and then if whoever comes out on top, Chariot's a great front runner, and he could get him all the way. And then who's got the battle in the last 100 meters? I guess a lot like the Olympic Games final, but a little bit faster in the middle laps. And then the other factor which affects the pacemaking, and it's not often talked about, and it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine throughout my career, the way that the races are set up is they often have way too many guys on the start line. 15, 16, 17, 18, up to 20 guys on the start line. And other than just fighting people on the start line and pushing and shoving, the big issue that causes is in order to get out in front of them, you have to sprint like a madman the first 100 meters. So if you're running a 12 high or a 13 low for the first 100, in order to hit your desired 300 meter split, you suddenly have to brake again. And then you got to re-accelerate again after you hit your 400 in order to maintain pace. So it really throws off the rhythm. And I think that's where in the past, some races that I was in Paris, Mehdi Bala was the big star of France at the time, and he could sort of dictate to the meet directors, hey, I only want 12 or 13 guys in the race. And the beauty of that is we all sort of understood Bala was going to be the guy get behind a rabbit, and we all just filter into line, and we didn't really bother the first 100 meters. You just like eased in yourself into the race. And I think Jakob's that sort of runner. He's not a guy that will be blistering off the start line, and he doesn't want to have to be working his way through the field in the first couple of laps to get into position. They really need to set up a race. I know this is probably the hardest ask of all, is like 6 or 8 people in it, and they all have pre-arranged decision that they're all going to filter in behind and not get off the line hard and let Jakob have a free line. I think that's what it's going to take in order for that first lap to be a 55.0 to get to 150, but they just like cruise through that first 150 meters so he can run unimpeded, not run the extra distance. And those are the reasons why I'm not sure that this season it's really a realistic viability. So no, I don't think he can get it this season, but next year I definitely think if Monaco, who have already shown in the past that they're willing to set up races for fast times being the primary goal, they might be willing to set up a race with just a handful of guys in the race, 8 or 9 guys. They have designated pacemakers, but they also, as I've known that they've done in the past, they've paid the third place runner in the line behind the 2 rabbits, the person who pushes the third and start of the 4th laps, a pre-arranged fee to commit to being the one to keep the train going throughout the race, even though they're going to be a finisher. And so I think that's probably the most likely way that he can do it, is if Chariot is paid as the third pacemaker, but he's still going to finish, and then they battle to the line. So yeah, this year it's going to be close. If the weather was better in Hayward, the mile might be under threat, but I think the wind's going to be a factor that's going to stop them for that. The one caveat, if they were willing to figure out a way to set up a race outside of the traditional World Athletics Grand Prix circuit, is to go back to this track that many of us in the past have run at and run many of our season's best, and it's where what I think is the best distance world record, the 720 and the 3000 by Daniel Komen, and that was set at Rieti, which is like 75 minutes outside of Rome. There's something unique about that track. I'm sure it's the right distance, but I think that it's just the perfect environment. It's crazy hard, and everyone's run fast. And even when I thought I was way out of shape, still ran my season's best. Maybe Gert and Jakob and take some of his brothers to be his rabbits, and pay Elliot Giles to be the 1200 pacemaker and go out and just run a time trial. It won't be the big fanfare and the big crowd and whatnot, but that's one magical place where I think it could be possible this season to set up their own race. So yeah, here's it to you guys. I think it's possible, but I would predict that it's not going to happen this season, and maybe it's going to have to wait a couple of years to be in Monaco, where you can pretty much guarantee it's perfect weather. They're going to have the right pacemakers, and they're willing to set up the race to be focused on trying to break that magical marker 3:26. It's about time. I'd really like to see it. All right, good luck, man.